The glare of the CNN studio lights cut through the tension like a blade, casting sharp shadows across the set as Representative Matt Gaetz's voice rose, each word landing like a challenge hurled across a battlefield. His finger, rigid and accusing, found its mark on Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. "How long have you been in Congress?" he demanded, his tone more like a prosecutor than a fellow lawmaker. "And what have you actually accomplished?" The air seemed to tighten. Gaetz leaned forward, seizing the moment, refusing to let the host, or anyone, break his momentum. "The American people deserve results," he pressed, "not more speeches, not more sound bites, real action." The hosts shifted uncomfortably, their attempts to regain control drowned beneath Gaetz's relentless cadence. He didn't just speak, he cut. "Your constituents didn't send you here to play pundit. Name one, just one, meaningful piece of legislation you've passed." His voice rose with each syllable, the final words hanging in the air like a dare. The camera caught Crockett in stark contrast, still, deliberate, her eyes steady. She didn't flinch, didn't interrupt. She waited, as though letting him run headlong into his own overreach. The host tried again, her tone strained. "Congressman, please." But Gaetz surged over her words once more. Then, a rare silence. A pause just long enough for the host to cut in with practiced precision. "Congresswoman Crockett, you have 30 seconds before we go to break." What happened in the next half-minute would shatter the rhythm of the exchange and the internet. In a measured tone, Crockett dismantled the accusations, each word chosen with surgical care. But she didn't stop at defense. She revealed something unexpected, something Gaetz had not anticipated, a fact that flipped the entire narrative on its head. The studio's air shifted. Even through the camera, viewers could feel it. The host blinked, stunned. Gaetz sat motionless for a beat too long. By the time the segment ended, the clip was already on its way to dominating social media feeds, its virality fueled not by shouting, but by a perfectly timed revelation. If you want more moments like this, those sharp, unfiltered exchanges the mainstream tends to overlook, subscribe and ring the bell. The next deep dive into congressional clashes might just change how you see American politics. Matt Gaetz's career had always been defined by moments like this. At 41, in his fourth term representing Florida, he had built his reputation on confrontation, an unapologetic firebrand, quick with a challenge, quicker with a retort. Trained in law, tempered in the Florida House, Gaetz had mastered the art of political combat. But as that night proved, even the most seasoned fighters can be caught off guard when the other side refuses to play by their rules. For years, Representative Matt Gaetz had cultivated an image as the lawmaker unafraid to confront his opponents head-on. His reputation wasn't built on quiet diplomacy. It was forged in the heat of public clashes, where direct challenges and sharp rhetoric were his weapons of choice. In recent months, his focus had sharpened even further. He had turned his attention toward what he called the failures of Democratic leadership, naming names and targeting specific lawmakers with an intensity that guaranteed headlines and a flood of social media engagement. The more traction his confrontations gained online, the bolder, even more combative his tactics became. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett represented almost the opposite political archetype. The 42-year-old Democrat from Texas, now in her second term, had walked a far different path to Washington. Before politics, she had carved out a career as a formidable civil rights attorney, a decade as a public defender, countless hours in courtrooms, and a track record of winning complex, high-profile cases that demanded both intellectual rigor and moral resolve. Inside Congress, she carried that same precision into her legislative work. Crockett wasn't a headline chaser. She preferred the grind of policy drafting, committee negotiations, and coalition building. While others sought camera time, she pored over the fine print of bills, details her colleagues, even across the aisle, privately acknowledged with respect. The CNN segment had been billed as a straightforward policy discussion. The topic? A newly passed infrastructure funding package, a rare piece of legislation with at least some bipartisan support. Each representative was invited to argue their side, Gaetz to critique, Crockett to defend. But the moment the cameras rolled, the script began to unravel. Gaetz wasted no time steering the conversation away from the technicalities of infrastructure funding. Instead, he aimed for something broader and far more personal. His attacks zeroed in on the credibility of Democratic lawmakers themselves, with Crockett squarely in his sights. 5 minutes in, the gloves came off. The American people are tired of representatives who accomplish nothing but claim credit for everything, Gaetz declared, his voice sharpened to a point. He turned directly toward Crockett, the cameras catching the unwavering challenge in his eyes. Congresswoman Crockett is a perfect example. Someone who gives great speeches, but has zero actual legislative accomplishments. All through Gaetz's increasingly animated monologue, Jasmine Crockett sat poised, her expression giving nothing away. She glanced at her notes once or twice, not nervously, but with the quiet assurance of someone who had come armed with more than just talking points. What the audience didn't yet know was that buried in those pages was information, specific, verifiable, and damning to Gaetz's claims, that could dismantle his portrayal of her record in a matter of seconds. The stage was primed for one of the most striking and unexpected political reversals live television had seen in years. Have you ever watched a moment where someone's carefully rehearsed narrative unraveled instantly under the weight of cold, undeniable facts? This was about to be one of those moments. The host, sensing the exchange had tilted too far into one-sided territory, raised her hand. "Let me just jump in here," she said, voice measured but firm. "We need to give Congresswoman Crockett an opportunity to respond to these criticisms." Gaetz wasn't ready to yield. "The American people deserve to know the truth about who's actually working for them in Washington," he said, leaning forward, cutting across the host's sentence. His words came faster now, riding on the momentum of his own certainty. "My office has passed multiple pieces of meaningful legislation, while the Congresswoman—" He paused just long enough to sharpen the blow, has been focused on media appearances. The host's tone hardened. "And Congressman Gaetz, we've heard your perspective for several minutes now. In fairness, we need to allow Congresswoman Crockett to respond." Gaetz leaned back, the faintest smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. He gestured toward her like a man certain of victory. "By all means," he said, dripping with confidence. "I'd love to hear about all these accomplishments I must have missed." The camera shifted. Crockett straightened in her chair, the studio lights catching the calm glint in her eyes. She looked first at the host, then directly into the camera, her voice carrying the weight of someone who knew she had the facts and the timing on her side. "Thank you for the opportunity to respond," she began, steady, deliberate. The control in her tone was palpable. The host gave a brief nod. "You have about 30 seconds before we need to—" "Break in 30 seconds, the host reminded her. Crockett reached forward and opened the slim folder that had sat untouched until now. "I appreciate Congressman Gaetz's concern about legislative accomplishments," she began, her tone measured, absent of the emotional edge that had colored Gaetz's delivery. Across the table, Gaetz smirked faintly, expecting a defensive scramble, perhaps even a stammer. Instead, Crockett continued with surgical precision. "Since the congressman is so interested in specifics, I thought it might be helpful to discuss the Justice System Improvement Act, which passed last session." She drew a document from her folder and laid it flat on the desk, angled toward the nearest camera. Under the studio lights, the seal of Congress was unmistakable, sections neatly highlighted in yellow. "This bill," she said, "expanded resources for public defenders and reformed sentencing guidelines for nonviolent offenses. It also included 3 key amendments I authored. Her voice remained calm, steady, but with each word, the balance of power in the room began to tilt. Then she added the line that made Gaetz's smirk falter. "What might interest viewers," she said, flipping a page, "is that one of those amendments was developed in direct collaboration with Congressman Gaetz's own office." The camera cut to Gaetz. His expression, once casually dismissive, sharpened, his eyes narrowing, jaw tightening. "In fact," Crockett continued, sliding another page into view, "I have here the email correspondence between our legislative directors, coordinating on the exact language that was included in the final bill." The host's eyebrows lifted, caught between surprise and intrigue. "Are you saying you and Congressman Gaetz worked together on this?" "Our offices certainly did," Crockett confirmed. "The amendment on prosecutorial transparency was jointly drafted by our teams. It's one of several bipartisan efforts that don't usually make headlines, but they show how Congress can, in fact, function effectively when we put aside the cameras and focus on results." Gaetz leaned forward now, his earlier confidence giving way to visible unease. "I think the Congresswoman is mischaracterizing." Gaetz began to deflect, framing it as a matter of routine staff interactions, some staff-level discussions. But Crockett was ready. Without raising her voice, she lifted another document from her folder. "I also have here," she said, holding it so the camera could clearly see the seal and timestamp, "the official congressional record from the floor debate, where Congressman Gaetz himself spoke in favor of this amendment. He specifically described it as, and I quote, exactly the kind of cooperation Americans deserve from their representatives." For a moment, the studio air seemed to still. The host leaned forward slightly, trying to keep her composure. "Well, this is certainly an interesting development. Congressman Gaetz, would you like to respond?" Gaetz shifted in his chair, his earlier forward-leaning aggression replaced by a guarded posture. "There are thousands of amendments and bills moving through Congress," he began. "My staff works with many offices on technical aspects of legislation. That doesn't change the broader point about leadership." Crockett nodded, the gesture polite, almost disarming. "I completely agree. One example doesn't tell the whole story. Which is why," she said, sliding another folder onto the desk, "I've brought the complete legislative report from the last session." The host glanced at the thick packet of papers, while Crockett continued, steady and precise. "In that session alone, my office successfully incorporated 17 amendments into past legislation, 9 of which had Republican co-sponsors. 2 of those were directly supported by Congressman Gaetz." Her hand rested lightly on the report as she added, "What's particularly relevant is that these amendments addressed the very government efficiency and accountability measures the Congressman just described as his priorities." The host, sensing a shift in the conversation, adjusted her approach. "So, what you're suggesting," she said slowly, "is that despite the public disagreements we see, there's actually far more bipartisan cooperation happening behind the scenes." "That's precisely my point," Crockett confirmed, her tone unwavering. "The American people deserve to know that while public disagreements may make for compelling television, the real work of legislating often comes from finding areas of agreement, sometimes even with those who appear to be your fiercest opponents." "Party lines," Crockett concluded, her voice still even. Gaetz seized the pause. "No one's suggesting there isn't occasional cooperation on minor provisions, but the fundamental direction of Democratic leadership—" "With respect, Congressman," Crockett cut in, the calm in her tone now edged with directness. "These weren't minor provisions." She turned a page in her folder. "The prosecutorial transparency amendment you supported has already changed how federal cases are documented in 3 states, directly addressing concerns you yourself have raised about accountability in the justice system." Without missing a beat, she flipped to another section. And since you brought up the infrastructure bill we were invited here to discuss, I should note that the oversight provision requiring quarterly public reporting on expenditures, a measure you praised in your own newsletter last month, was an amendment I introduced in committee. It passed with support from your colleague, Congressman Roy. The host glanced down, hand pressed to her earpiece. We need to take a break shortly, she said. But before we do, Congressman Gaetz, would you like to respond to these specific examples? Gaetz straightened his tie, an almost imperceptible tell that he was buying time. I think we're getting lost in congressional procedure here, he said, his voice steadier now but lacking its earlier punch. The broader point remains that Democratic leadership has failed to address the fundamental challenges facing Americans. Crockett didn't let the moment pass. I understand the congressman's desire to maintain a narrative of total opposition, she said, but the documented reality of our legislative work tells a more nuanced story. The question for viewers is whether they prefer representatives who emphasize division for media attention, or those who identify specific areas of agreement while still holding to their core principles. As the cameras prepared to cut away, Gaetz leaned forward toward the documents spread on the desk, scanning the highlighted lines. His earlier certainty was gone, replaced by something quieter, the measured caution of a man suddenly aware that the next words he chose could follow him far beyond the walls of that studio. Gaetz's earlier confidence had thinned, replaced by a quiet, visible concern. When the program returned from commercial break, the atmosphere in the studio had shifted. The energy was less combative now, measured, watchful. Gaetz, who had spent the break poring over the documents Crockett had placed before him, no longer wore the same forward-leaning bravado. Welcome back to our discussion, the host began, her tone tinged with curiosity. Before the break, Congresswoman Crockett presented some surprising information about collaborative legislative efforts. Congressman Gaetz, you've now had a chance to review that documentation. What are your thoughts? Gaetz shifted in his chair, his voice more restrained. Look, there's no question that staff from various offices work together on technical aspects of legislation. That's part of how Congress functions. My concern remains with the overall direction of policy. The host leaned in slightly. But you did support the specific amendments Congresswoman Crockett mentioned. There was a brief hesitation, just long enough for the cameras to catch it, before Gaetz replied. Certain provisions addressing transparency and accountability align with principles I've consistently supported. That doesn't change my fundamental disagreements with the broader agenda. Crockett nodded, her expression steady. And that's precisely my point. Effective legislators can maintain their core principles while still finding specific areas where cooperation serves their constituents' interests. The narrative that Congress is completely dysfunctional overlooks the regular, if limited, collaboration that produces tangible results. She reached for her folder again, this time producing a thick, tabbed report. The soft shuffle of paper was audible in the otherwise still studio. I've maintained a detailed record of every amendment and bill I've worked on since joining Congress, who supported each measure and the ultimate outcome. I share this with my constituents regularly. The host turned toward her. And what does that record show about working across the aisle? Crockett met her gaze without hesitation. It shows exactly what I've been saying, described earlier, Crockett replied without hesitation. In the last session alone, 43% of the amendments I successfully attached to past legislation had at least one Republican co-sponsor. Several of those cooperative efforts directly addressed issues Congressman Gaetz himself has identified as priorities: government transparency, reducing unnecessary regulations, and strengthening oversight. The host turned toward Gaetz. Is Congresswoman Crockett correct that these are priorities you've emphasized? Gaetz gave a curt nod. Certainly. I've been consistent in advocating for greater transparency and accountability in government. Then perhaps, the host suggested, a faint note of curiosity in her voice, there's more common ground between your positions than your earlier exchange would suggest. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her tone sharpening just enough to draw the distinction. I think it's important to separate performative opposition from principled disagreement. Performative opposition makes for compelling television, but rarely delivers results. Principled disagreement allows us to find targeted areas of agreement, even when we hold very different overall perspectives. She placed another document on the desk, her movements deliberate. This is especially relevant to the infrastructure bill we were invited to discuss. While Congressman Gaetz opposed the overall package, a position I respect based on his stated principles, his office provided valuable input on 3 oversight provisions that were ultimately incorporated into the final legislation. The host's eyebrows rose. Is that accurate? Gaetz paused, the silence stretching for a beat before he answered. My staff regularly provides technical feedback on legislation, even on bills I ultimately oppose. That's part of responsible governance. Exactly, Crockett affirmed, nodding once. And that's precisely the kind of nuance that disappears in the oversimplified narrative of Congress as completely divided. The reality is far more complex, and in many ways, far more encouraging for citizens concerned about how their government actually functions, whether their government can function effectively. By now, the combative edge that had opened the segment had softened into something more reflective. The host leaned forward, sensing the shift. Congresswoman Crockett, you mentioned keeping a detailed record of your legislative work. Do you believe that's something all representatives should do? Absolutely, Crockett answered without pause. Accountability begins with transparency. My constituents deserve to know exactly how I'm using the authority they've entrusted to me, where I've found common ground with colleagues across the aisle, and where I've stood in principled opposition. She turned toward Gaetz, her tone respectful, but pointed. I suspect Congressman Gaetz's office maintains similar records. I imagine his constituents would see that his legislative work contains more examples of practical cooperation than his public statements might suggest. Gaetz, now leaning into the discussion, replied evenly, My office certainly tracks our accomplishments. Where we may differ is in how we frame that work to our constituents. That's fair, Crockett acknowledged with a nod. Different representatives highlight different aspects of their work, depending on what they believe matters most to the people they serve. As the segment's clock wound down, the host posed a final question. Your closing thoughts? Gaetz spoke first. I still believe there are fundamental differences in vision between the parties, and voters should understand those clearly. But Congresswoman Crockett has made fair points about how the legislative process incorporates multiple perspectives, even when there's disagreement on the broader direction. Crockett met his gaze. And on that, we actually agree. Clear articulation of principles strengthens democracy. The common ground we found today is proof that principled debate and practical cooperation aren't mutually exclusive. They're both essential to making this institution work. The host looked from one to the other, the earlier tension now replaced by something unexpected: mutual acknowledgement. Acknowledging that principled disagreements can exist alongside genuine cooperation on specific measures. As the cameras prepared to fade out, viewers caught an unscripted moment. Gaetz leaning toward Crockett, saying something just out of earshot that drew a nod from her and then one from him. It was a brief exchange, but the mutual recognition was unmistakable, a striking bookend to the combative tone that had opened the segment. The impact was immediate. Within hours, clips flooded social media, amassing millions of views and sparking thousands of comments. The shift was what gripped people, the transformation from sharp-edged political theater to a grounded, fact-driven conversation. The moment Crockett calmly placed her evidence on the desk, dismantling Gaetz's earlier claims without raising her voice, became the segment's inflection point. Major news outlets pounced. Headlines framed the encounter as an unexpected moment of cooperation between two lawmakers typically cast as polar opposites. Political analysts from across the spectrum weighed in, many pointing out how rarely the mechanics of actual bipartisan work break through the noise of partisan combat. What we saw was a rare window into how Congress really operates, observed veteran political correspondent James. Crockett essentially pulled back the curtain on the gap between public performance and practical governance. The Washington Post followed up with a detailed breakdown of the very legislation Crockett cited, confirming her account. Their analysis showed that the bipartisan provisions she referenced had, in fact, been negotiated and implemented, quietly, without fanfare, underscoring just how often cooperation happens in the shadows, far from the cameras. Amendments she referenced had, in fact, been quietly folded into previous legislation, with backing from offices scattered across the political spectrum. On social media, the reaction snowballed. The clip became a springboard for a bigger conversation. Were the media and political communications machines addicted to conflict at the expense of substance? Thousands of users began posting other overlooked examples of bipartisan work, piecing together a very different picture of Congress, one that valued quiet progress over camera-ready confrontation. For Representative Crockett, the aftermath brought unexpected openings. Invitations poured in from national outlets, eager to discuss not just what she had said, but how she had handled it. In interviews, she articulated her guiding philosophy: hold to your principles, but stay open to cooperation when it benefits the people you represent. The documentation I keep isn't for ambush moments like the one with Congressman Gaetz, she told one primetime anchor. It's for accountability, so my constituents know exactly what I've done with the trust they've given me. The habit, she explained, came from her years as an attorney. I learned that evidence speaks louder than assertions. That's true in a courtroom, and it's true in Congress. Rhetoric might make headlines, but legislation changes lives. Even academia took notice. Political science departments at several universities began weaving the exchange into coursework as a case study in reframing political narratives. Professor Eleanor Martinez of Georgetown University summed it up. This was a textbook example of how thorough preparation can flip the script in real time. In one moment, a narrative built on assumption was replaced with a story grounded in documented fact, using it to teach students not just the mechanics of legislation, but the subtle chess game of political communication. For Representative Gaetz, the moment was a double-edged sword. The viral clip brought a wave of attention, some of it skeptical. Certain supporters voiced disappointment, framing the acknowledgement of shared legislative wins with a Democrat as political backsliding. But Gaetz, a seasoned communicator, moved quickly to steady the ground beneath him. In follow-up appearances, he leaned into the nuance. I have never compromised on my core conservative principles, he told a popular radio host, his tone firm but measured. What Representative Crockett highlighted were provisions that strengthen government accountability and transparency, values I've fought for my entire career. 2 weeks later, an op-ed bearing his byline appeared in a major paper. It wasn't defensive, it was deliberate. He drew a sharp line between principled opposition and practical governance. True representation, he argued, meant doing both, speaking clearly about differences while rolling up your sleeves to secure wins for your constituents. These aren't contradictions, he wrote. They're the twin responsibilities of responsible leadership. The ripple effect extended beyond the principles in the exchange. In the weeks that followed, political shows that once thrived solely on soundbite clashes began experimenting with something rare: substance. Segments dug deeper into legislative text, asking lawmakers to walk viewers through where cooperation had actually happened, and why. The public noticed. A national poll, taken 1 month after the exchange, found that 78% of respondents wanted more coverage of the day-to-day work of Congress, especially when it revealed unlikely partnerships, while only 22% still preferred the spectacle of perpetual conflict. The appetite for something real was there. The question now was whether the media and the politicians themselves would deliver. Confrontational clashes that usually dominate political TV. Network executives noticed. One cable news producer, speaking anonymously to the Columbia Journalism Review, admitted, "The Gaetz-Crockett moment revealed an appetite for substance we've been underestimating." But the impact went beyond programming decisions. It cracked open a bigger conversation about the way politics is covered and the way it's practiced. In the weeks that followed, major outlets published in-depth analyses on the incentive structures that reward spectacle over substance, and how both politicians and the media have too often been complicit in that imbalance. Veteran lawmakers weighed in too. Former Speaker of the House John Boehner put it plainly. What viewers saw was something that happens every day in Congress, but almost never makes headlines. Representatives with opposing visions finding specific issues where cooperation works better than conflict. That's how the system is supposed to function. 6 weeks later, Crockett and Gaetz found themselves sharing a Sunday morning stage. The contrasts between them were still stark, their political philosophies intact, but their mutual respect was clear. Both made a point to pull back the curtain for viewers. "This kind of cooperation doesn't erase our bigger differences," Gaetz told the host. "It simply recognizes that even representatives on opposite sides can agree on provisions that directly serve their districts. That's not weakness. It's the practical side of representation." Crockett nodded in agreement. Effective representation means standing firm on principles, yes, but it also means finding real, workable solutions where they exist. That's what people send us here to do. The moment wasn't about winning an argument. It was about showing the country a version of Congress that still knows how to work. Ways to advance those principles in a chamber as diverse and divided as Congress. Voters, they agreed, deserve to see both sides of the job, the uncompromising defense of values, and the strategic cooperation that gets real results. When the moderator asked if political discourse would improve by focusing more on tangible legislative work rather than broad partisan posturing, Crockett didn't hesitate. Absolutely. Democracy works best when people know what their representatives are actually doing, the stands they take, the fights they choose, and the solutions they help craft. Gaetz, still firmly rooted in his own worldview, nevertheless conceded the point. Clear principles matter. They give voters a real choice. But Representative Crockett is right. Accountability isn't just about speeches or slogans. It's about documented accomplishments people can point to. As the cameras rolled, viewers saw something rare in modern political media. Two lawmakers from opposite ideological poles finding common ground. Not by watering down their beliefs, but by recognizing the messy truth of governing, that it requires both conviction and collaboration, and a willingness to be transparent about both. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett's few deliberate words, anchored by meticulous facts and delivered without theatrics, did more than diffuse a heated exchange. They shifted the tone entirely, creating a moment of clarity and substance in a space usually ruled by noise and conflict. It was a glimpse into how Congress actually works, when the spotlight isn't blinding, when representatives speak to inform rather than to perform. If you found this breakdown insightful and want more content that cuts past the political theater to reveal what's really happening behind the scenes, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're here to bring you the stories and perspectives that rarely make it into standard coverage. And in the comments, tell us, What other corners of congressional life should we pull into the light next?